Hello and welcome to analysis of topic 2, children's names and childhood memories. So, just before we do the analysis today, I'd like to discuss 3 of the most important things I feel should be mentioned to students in regards to their speaking exam. So, without being very specific about each section, I really want to speak generally here, so I've given some general speaking tips. Now, number 1, a question that I'm often asked by students is, how long should my answer be? And there is no right or wrong that's specified in the exam. However, let's look at it from a common sense point of view. If your answer is too long, you're going to be constantly interrupted by the examiner. If anybody has taken an IELTS exam before in the past, and they may have experienced that, and sometimes it can leave the student feeling a little bit anxious, a little bit worried, and that can lead into the student actually underperforming in the exam if they don't understand why that's happening. And it's purely happening because there's only 10 to 14 minutes for the exam to take place, and the examiner needs to ask you a range of questions in order to test your English skills. So that could happen. So it could be too long, and it could be too short. If it's just sort of 1 or 2 word answers, it gives the examiner nothing to test. And don't forget, they're testing your English. So, what should you do in part 1? Well, I suggest that you give maybe 1 or 2 sentences, okay? Complex sentences are nice if you can do that. And you should, of course, stay on topic. Don't deviate from the question. Don't go off on a tangent, as they say. So really concentrate and focus on what the question is actually asking you, and make sure that you understand that. That's good if you can practice some questions beforehand, of course. And then next is paraphrasing. So what do I mean by that? Well, in the previous video of topic 2, children's names and childhood memories, I asked Tang in part 1 if she thought children's names were important. Now, paraphrasing would think about using different words or different word forms for the key words in that question. So children's names, well, you can't really paraphrase that. I mean, you could say kids' names instead of children's names, but names are names, so you can't paraphrase that word. But the word important could be paraphrased, and so you could change that. Now, how could we say that differently? Well, there are other synonyms for important, such as crucial, essential, it matters, and so there's different ways of saying that. So my response to that question might be, well, I think kids' names are crucial because, and then I would give my reason, and that would be the end of my part 1 answer. It would be shorter than a part 3 answer, but still give the examiner something to test, something to examine. And that would be how I would handle my part 1s. Now, part 3s are different. In my part 3, the length of my answer would be longer. I would give my statement, and then give my reasons for that statement, and I'd provide maybe some examples to go along with it. If I wanted to, optionally, I might even summarize the question at the end. So I might say something like, overall, I think this, or, in all, I think that. So there are different ways of, you don't want to sound too formal when you're speaking. You don't want to say, so in conclusion, because that kind of sounds very formal, and then you sound like, overly formal, and we don't speak that way. If you want to say things like in conclusion, in summary, save that for the writing tasks. Okay, I hope that helps. Any questions? Just pop them under the video and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So let's move on to part 1. Now in part 1 I asked Tang, do children's names matter? And she replied saying, yes, I think they're important because it's something your parents gave you and it's something that people will remember you by. Your name will stick with you for the rest of your life. So when she says it will stick with you, we use that word stick to mean something that will always be with you. It will stick with you. Okay, so my friends might stick with me if they're really good friends, and no matter what happens, they will always be there. So it's really referring to something that is permanent. It has permanence. So that word permanent means forever. Okay. Now, of course, nothing is forever, but we're talking in our own time frame, in our own lifetime. Secondly, I said to her, how did your parents choose your name? And then she replied saying they selected a few girly names and then they decided to go with Tang Bun in the end. So first of all, she uses the term girly. Now, it should be pointed out that girly is a real adjective. However, it usually has a derogatory meaning. So she hasn't used it incorrectly, but perhaps not quite appropriately. But girly really means she's really using it in the way that she means it sounds feminine. And then finally she says they decided to go with Tang Bun. So if you go with something, then you have made the decision to do that thing. You have selected that and gone on. So then in the next question, I ask her, is your name common or unusual in your country? Tang replies that she thinks her name is quite rare. But she also says, a very fun fact. Now, she uses that phrase or that expression, a very fun fact, to introduce an interesting point or a point that she is going to make that she thinks might be interesting to others. Okay, so she then says a very fun fact is that there is an actress in Vietnam who was in the Star Wars movies that also shares the same name as her. So if you're going to introduce something interesting, you might want to think about using that expression before you introduce the point that you think is quite interesting. Now, it's probably going to be related to something also not only interesting, but entertaining, something that ticks both of those boxes. Is it interesting? Is it entertaining? If so, you might use that expression, a very fun fact, and then give that interesting and entertaining point that you want to make. Now in part 2, Tang speaks about a special childhood memory that she can still remember. Now she uses an interesting idiom in this section. And that idiom is, I have a memory like a sieve. In fact, she begins her section by using that idiom. She says, even though I have a memory like a sieve. A sieve, S-I-E-V-E, is a kitchen utensil. We hold it and we pour flour through it and it has lots of holes in it. It's really saying that her memory has a lot of holes. So it's another way of saying, I don't have a very good memory. And then she begins to speak about her childhood experience. She actually does speak really well about her experience and has a lot of detail. And it doesn't really matter that she's said that I don't have a good memory in the beginning. What's more important is that she used the idiom, but she also used the idiom properly, appropriately. Now, another tip about idioms is that if you are going to use an idiom, you must be 100% certain that you're using that idiom properly and correctly. If you're doing that, then you're going to get good scores in your vocabulary section. If you use the idiom inappropriately, that can be a negative. So it's always good to get a few idioms together that you're comfortable with, that you can use. And of course, the whole purpose of these analysis videos is to give you perhaps a few idioms that you feel comfortable using. And you're going to build up those idioms as the weeks go on. I'm going to give you more and more of those idioms and explain exactly how to use them. Okay, so that's the idiom, and that's the only one she uses in this particular part 2, whereas in the part one video, that is topic 1, she used several idioms in that one, and it's just from test to test, that's going to change. The topic lends itself sometimes to using more idioms than other topics do. So it's just really a little bit of luck sometimes on what questions you get, what topic you get, and whether or not the idioms that you have in your tool bag are going to be able to be used in that particular topic. So let's move on to part 3. So let's look at some of the advanced vocabulary that was used by Tang in this particular topic. One of the words that Tang used was the adjective traumatic. She used this in the first answer in part 3, when she was asked if children could be permanently affected by negative childhood memories. Traumatic means something very negative has happened to somebody. They have had an experience which they find it very difficult to forget. Of course, let's think of examples of what a traumatic experience might be. Let's take it to the extreme. Perhaps you were in an earthquake as a child. That would be very traumatic. Perhaps you were bullied as a child. That could also be traumatic in a slightly different way. So it could be physical trauma where you're actually injured, and that would be a physical trauma coming from the word traumatic. Or you might have a psychological trauma, okay? She also used the word insecure. Insecure was used in the same answer. If somebody is insecure, it's the opposite of confident, okay? So it's an antonym. An antonym, of course, is the opposite of a word, a synonym being a word that has a similar meaning to a word. So insecure is an antonym of confident. And of course, that insecurity could lead to having poor relationships, bad work relationships, and so on and so forth. But anything negative that might happen as a consequence of not being confident. In another question in part 3, I asked Tang what it meant to be living in the past, or what does it mean to live in the past. And in that she mentioned the word fond to an adjective that she put with memories. So she said fond memories. Fond means pleasant or good, okay? But it's a higher level piece of vocabulary that you can use instead of good or pleasant. And so if you have a fond memory, you have some memory of very pleasurable experience, and of course that's going to make you smile and make you happy and have really good consequences for you in your future life. Vividly was a word that she used in her part 2 monologue. She said, "I still remember vividly." So vividly is the adverb modifying the verb remember, and it really means that she has a very clear and strong memory. If you have a vivid memory, it's very clear, very strong. Okay, so vivid is the adjective and vividly is the adverb. I then asked her in another part 3 question, do you think that parents ever spoil their children? Now, if you're spoiling your children, that means you're giving them too much. You're giving them anything that they want, anything that they ask for, whether it be money or gifts or sweets or other items that you think are maybe going to keep them quiet, okay? Now, Tang made the point that if you overindulge your children, so overindulge, if you give them too much of something that's good, that will lead them to have a sense of entitlement. Now, I haven't put entitlement up on the board, but entitlement means that you think that you deserve everything. If you are an entitled person, then you have that feeling from within that you deserve anything. And so she made the point that if you overindulge your children, they could end up, which is a phrasal verb, they could end up, which means they could become, if we end up, we become a spoiled brat. And that term spoiled, again, means they have been given too much, and the word brat is a word that we use to describe a child who is poorly behaved, has that sense of entitlement. They think they deserve everything. And that's really coming from being overindulged, being given everything that they want to be given. That's it for today's analysis. I hope that you've enjoyed it. It's been useful for you and that you will be able to take some of these words and terms and idioms that we've looked at today and use them in your speaking sections. Good to see you again, and I'll see you for topic 3. Bye-bye.